Oh, all right. Um, I'm Mark Holford. I've been a collector for a long time, as you'll see, and about what to me being a collector means. Um, so, with that, I'm going to tell you about where my collection is. It's been in two houses, or most of it has been in two houses over the last nearly 30 years, and you'll find out where they are. I think it's worth perhaps saying that there is a big difference between glass collecting in the US and glass collecting in the UK. In America, I think it would probably be fair to say that glass collecting or glass is the top of the craft pile, if you like, whereas in the UK, it's probably the opposite. Much better collected are things like ceramics. We have no, I think, really large collectors. I don't know, I think, $1 million collector in the UK of modern glass. So it's a different scene. And so, and I think it's also affected by the size of our houses. By and large, particularly if you live in London, the houses are relatively small, even the big ones, unless you're Mr. Abramovich. So with that, if I can get my thing to move. Sorry, I'm having, oh, there we are. So you probably saw before, those of you who came in recently, I started with the Union Jack, but then I was in fact sitting in front of what is about 80% of my glass collection is on these 20 shelves. And I'll be talking, I should think, about something around a quarter to a third of it. I'll certainly be talking about all the prominent pieces I have. But they aren't just on the shelves. I have a very tolerant wife because I'm actually sitting in my living room, which is also our music room. It has a baby grand piano. It has my exercise bike, and it's my office. So it's a multi-purpose room. And on every surface, the top two photographs being two of the surfaces of the room, is covered in glass, as is the windowsill, which is the bottom left. And then you can see the glass on the right in the living room with this gentleman chucking a rock at the rest of my collection. And we'll come back to him. Inside the house also on the stairs are three windowsills. And there, as you can see, the two on the left, they're covered in glass. That's two out of the three of them. And our entrance hall has also some glass in it, including an interesting ceiling. So I think, I'm not sure whether you know, but whether this was in the announcement, but I started collecting glass when I was 2.5. My mother gave me this Coronation Goblet. You can see the crown, and if you look carefully, the E2R. So that was in about June 1953. And I've still got it, and I think my brother has one as well. So, but I really didn't start collecting in what you might describe as any serious form until the early 80s. Before that, I had bought some Georgian glass, which I eventually sold. In fact, my uncle and aunt had given me a what I thought were fine pair of Georgian sweetmeat dishes. But when I came to sell them, unfortunately, they turned out to be forgeries, despite the fact that they had been actually sold by probably the most reputable glass dealer in London at the time. However, at the beginning of the 80s, I started to go to Scandinavia, which it seems rather suitable place to start, given the fact that this conference was originally going to be in Sweden, and I was really looking forward to going to that. I started to buy Costa Boda and other Scandinavian pieces, which at the time were modestly priced. They were about $100. And I think if you ask people about, people say I can't collect glass, it's too expensive. And I think that's nonsense. You can find really attractive pieces. And I really encourage people to start small and then build up. And if you get enthusiastic, well, then you get rather carried away. But these were the pieces I started with. The top two, I did some research about a year ago, and I discovered the top two are both Costa Boda. In fact, 3 out of these are Costa Boda. That's the top two on the left, and they're all by the Berlin family. The top two were designed by Ulrika Heidmann Berlin, and the bottom left was by Bertil. And then the piece on the bottom right is Holmegård, the Danish glassmaker, and it's designed by a chap called Per Lutkin. So that's where I started, and I've still got the pieces today. I think I would like you to unmute everybody, if you would, Kristen. And those in the know, please don't answer. But who are these by? Anybody know? I'll move on one slide just in case. Is that any help? Okay.
Philip and Monica.
Sorry?
That's a Philip Morgan and Monica Guggersberg.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So I'm going to introduce Philip and hand over to him to talk about the next 3 or 4 slides.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here with you. You have a interesting spectrum of work from us. These pieces, these 4 pictures here, take us back to the very beginnings of our studio 30 and 40 years ago, when we did principally tabletop glassware, very simple, clear designs, which we blew in our studio in all kinds of multiples over a period of about 10 or 15 years. Maybe go on to the next one.
I should say that how I came across Philip was, I think it was mid-90s. One of my wife's best friend lived in Geneva and still lives in Geneva. And she said, we're going to visit some glass blowing friends this afternoon, when we went to stay with them. And that was really the beginning of my downfall as a serious glass collector, because I bought these 4 and this. Over to you, Philip.
Yes, well, that's quite a contrast. It took us a while to, shall I say, break out of our obsession with design and making things in multiples. And this piece that you have here is part of probably our first really sculptural series. There are 3 discs superimposed one in front of the other and sandblasted with actual circles cut through. And they're very much exploring themes that we've been exploring all through our career, about very clear, simple lines and fundamental symbols, in this case, spheres, circles, wholeness, universal concepts. Good?
Shall I move on?
Sure.
Actually, just before I do, just notice the stand shape, because I'm going to talk about that later. Sounds a funny comment, but I'll explain why later on.
So this is a very unusual piece, because I think only about 5 of them were made, and we made them expressly to accompany the first exhibition we did around boats. Some of you may have seen these boats. They're metal framed vessels in iconic shape, filled with amphor, glass amphor in very much representative of commerce going back to the Phoenicians and throughout antiquity. And also, it's also a very personal reflection, because we ourselves are very nomadic. And so these boats and their amphor symbolize not only issues of the nomadic nature of civilization across the last several thousand years, but also our own personal trajectory, having lived in so many countries and moved around.
So, moving to the next one. Oh, sorry.
I don't think this is in your collection, but nevertheless, it's lovely.
No, I don't think so. It's a little big.
This is an installation that we did 2 years ago part of a series of installations at Canterbury Cathedral. It's actually in the form of a boat, very much to the millimeter, in the shape of the boats that we make ourselves in our studio. It's 100 quite large, meter-long amphor, each one representing a year since the end of the First World War and the armistice in 1918. And it was part of an exhibition we did to both commemorate the end of that war, as well as a reflection on the 100 years since that time, each amphor representing one of those 100 years.
And I should think the amphora were just a little bigger than the one I have, which is about
Quite a bit bigger. We did not blow them ourselves. They were blown in a little factory, wonderful little factory in Switzerland called Hergeswil.
yeah. Anyway, that's really kind, Philip. I should say you now live in Wales, just across the border from Ludlow, which we will return to in a minute, because this story is full of many intertwines, really, which I love, so we'll come back. So thank you, Philip, very much.
You're very welcome.
So moving on, my next sort of series of acquisition were these 9 pieces, in fact, there are 10, and I'll come back to the 10th later on because it has a wonderful story attached to it. These are, again, I paid about $750 for the 10, and they are by some various quite well-known people. Some of them no longer are working, but the one in the middle is by, which I think she was a student, by a quite well-known British artist called Angela Thwaites. The right-hand piece in the middle row and the bottom left-hand piece are by an Japanese artist called Kiniko Ito, who I don't think is around anymore. And the bottom right-hand piece is by a Czech maker called Blanka Adamsova, and we'll come back to her. It's a most exquisite piece. It's about an inch and a half cube with this beautiful leaf. And in fact, it isn't really quite as blue as it looks. It also has a pinkiness about it. And anyway, this sort of built my collection. But with it came another piece that I paid, I think, $1,500 for. And I don't think I need to ask you who made this. This is, of course, Harvey Littleton. And he, but just shortly before he died, I emailed him because I'd quite like to know the story behind the piece. And I asked him, and I can't remember what he said. He told me roughly when it was made and that sort of thing. But he said, "Where is it?" So I took him literally at his word. And this is the story I told him in an email. I said, "I think you ought to know roughly where I live." So here is an aerial view from Google Earth. And there are 1 or 2 quite well-known landmarks on this, notably this one. That is Buckingham Palace. And to the northwest of it, this one, that is the Royal Mews, and the garden is the Buckingham Palace is this triangle. And so I lived really quite close to the Queen in this street called Wilton Street. And he was rather amused by that because I then went on to say, this is our house. And this is a typical British terraced house. You can find them in every city in Britain. They're always this shape. They consist basically of a staircase all the way up one side and one and a half rooms sort of on every floor. And in this case, it's 5 stories high. You can have one that's 2 stories high. You can't see the 5th story because it's the basement. Then I showed him, this is a picture of our living room, which was on the 1st floor behind those French windows. And then I said, if you look on the right side of the fireplace, there's the piece sitting on the shelf. Now, the house I currently live in is very similar. It's also on 5 stories, but it's a third smaller because it's the size to the right of where I'm showing the cursor. And just to bring you up to date as to where I now live, I really just live around the corner in this place called Victoria Square. And arguably, I am the closest neighbor to the Queen because living in a house, because most of the houses around this area are in fact apartments. So I claim to be the Queen's closest neighbor in a house. A bit specious, but there we are. Anyway, this is ready to introduce our next artist, artists, who in about 2001 or 2, I think, we wanted a chandelier for the bottom of the stairs, at the bottom of the staircase. I thought that'd be quite nice, a glass chandelier. And I tried, and I wanted a modern one. I tried asking around and to commission one. It wasn't very successful. And I was just about to give up when I got this phone call from this couple who said, could we come around next Tuesday? So I said, all right, that's fine. I'll come at 6 o'clock. I'll give you a glass of wine. So they did. They came round and they said, we'll be back in 2 weeks. So they came back and the husband said, oh, I know what you want. You don't want a chandelier, you want an installation. I said, what do you mean I want an installation? He said, just leave it to me. So I did. And anyway, this is what they made. It's 5 glass sheets of glass which have been bent and sawn into. And they are all about the curtains in a theatre, because my wife is very heavily involved in opera, which is something we'll come back to. And they wanted to depict the idea of this being the curtains in a theatre. And you can see they cast very good shadows on the wall. And in fact, when we moved it, this is the same view in our new house, the difference being that the first photograph is taken from the front door looking at the staircase, whereas this one on the right is taken from standing on the staircase looking towards the front door. It actually works almost better because they fill the ceiling left to right or right to left, and actually the shadows cast are actually rather better. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to both the husband and the wife. The husband is Richard Jackson, but first of all, to introduce Sally Fawkes. And Richard and Sally, I probably have more works by them than any other artist in my collection. So Sally, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you tonight about some of the pieces of work that Mark has. The first piece on the left there, Mark actually bought before we first met him. So thank you, Mark, for supporting our work before you knew us. This piece he actually bought from an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And all through my 20 years actually we've had our studio, my work's always been about sort of complexity of place and space and how we experience it. And casting for me sort of gives you that metaphor for volume of space. So this piece that Mark bought from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Crafts Council also have one from this series in their collection, which they bought roughly about the same time. I think that was in 2000. So you can see how Mark's collected my work for 20 years now. The piece in the middle, Significant Ground, is probably one of the pieces that's most indicative of work that, if you know my work, you would recognise it by. I use mirrored planes, deep carved texture, engraving, and quite often colour as well with the pieces. And this piece is very sort of indicative of that period of time. I use, always when I'm researching my work, I'm always looking at history and how time layers over, and that can be taking marks that are physical, language, something I've heard. It could be inspired by music or just a concept that I've heard. And I always say that my pieces aren't time specific because I may bring lots of different aspects of things that I've heard or places I've been and bring them together just in the way we experience life now. Now on the right hand side, this piece is called Motion, and it's quite, it's actually a study for a larger piece that was bought by the Charleroi Museum in Belgium. I did a residency at Muse Vert in France back, I think it was 2017 now, 2017 or 18. And I spent 3 months there working with the local environment. And when I was there, the pieces of work I made, probably some of the first place and time specific that I've done. Now, here I actually experimented, and that's something that Mark has been very good as a collector of in supporting experimental work. And I think, Mark, it's true to say that you've possibly bought more of the sort of first pieces when I've potentially sort of taken a slightly different direction with work. And this piece, Motion, is one of them, where I'm working again still with mirror and engraving, and this piece and painted surfaces. And this piece was a study of the landscape where Muse Vert is, which is on the border with Belgium. And I created this piece of work in the centenary of the First World War, and a lot of the battles were played out in the area, and you can really feel a sense of the history of the last century in that area.
Good. And we'll come back to Sars pottery later on. And it's perhaps worth also saying that out of our opera festival came a collaboration with a composer on a video. So it's been a very interesting work together. So over to you, Richard, for some things you've done.
Well, again, thank you to Mark for collecting work that spans pretty much my whole career in terms of working full-time as an artist. The one on the top hand left side there is a very early piece from when Sally and I were first setting up our studio. So that's almost 20 years ago now.
I call it the Tarn Helm.
Yeah, do you know what? I can't actually find the original name for this anywhere at the moment. Our records are slightly in disarray that far back. But also, ever since you and Sarah told me that, I've not been able to think of it in another way. But this way of working was something that I came to when I first returned to the UK after being away for a couple of years when I lived in the San Francisco area, and I was working for the glass artist John Lewis there. And when I came back to the UK, the first stages of setting up a workshop, you don't have everything that you need, and this was a very experimental way of working for me. I had a lot of thick float glass, and I first started using a handheld diamond saw, and once the glass had been bent and shaped, the carving of the glass became a very experimental way of working with volume and form and the flow and the movement within the glass. And I soon moved on to this because I found it a little bit limiting, and I moved into working with kiln cast glass. And so the next two pieces, the one on the right hand side is Spirit House, which is a series that I'm still working with and have been for quite a few years now. And this came from originally when I was traveling for a year in Southeast Asia, and I everywhere I went, I was finding small little personal shrines, hand-built things, which were very obviously very much part of the spiritual way of life there. And it took me 8 years before I made my first Spirit House, and because there was a lot of processing to do in terms of what the piece was going to be about. The third piece is called Within, and this is very much to do with internal feelings, what you hide, what you reveal, and what you semi-reveal. And that's in the green glass, and I particularly like working with this glass. But that's me. Thank you.
Well, I think, although you think it's a Thai spirit house, I think of it as a Norman church, and I pass it every morning, and actually it reminds me of the village church and the place where my parents lived. And the green piece sits under the discs made by Philip and Monica, so it has a quite prominent position. You might have noticed it at the beginning. So moving on, I think we might unmute. I think anybody know who made this? He's also present today. Yes, you're right. So Colin, over to you.
Hi, Mark. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody being here. Yeah, so this is a piece. I'm trying to make out the date on it, but it was from the 1980s. When I graduated, I'd sort of stumbled into a way of working that I've really followed ever since, which is going to nature as a source of texture and form. And so this piece, the form is actually the interior space. It's a box. It's a two-part piece. The top lifts off and it's hollow inside. It's made from sand, and so the form is actually. Sorry, my computer's doing something. The form is actually built in reverse in sand and then cast in two parts, and then it's all ground and polished and so on. So I'd sort of, by this stage in the 80s, I kind of identified the key parts of the process that I wanted to work with. And I'm actually really pleased to see that you've got an example of that, Mark.
Well, it came from, I bought it in the auction following the closure of Well, when Pilkington sold off all their collection, Pilkington being the British equivalent of Corning, I suppose, because they were the inventors of the float glass process. And I think it was probably around the time they were bought by the Japanese. And I bought it at that point. Should we go to the next piece?
Yeah. So this is a piece from the 1990s, and in the I think 90 to 91, I spent a year in New Zealand doing residency, which was really wonderful. And one of the things that I did there was to start working with basalt, because there's so much basalt in New Zealand. I was in Auckland, which is basically, I think there's 50 volcanic cones in Auckland itself, so there's basalt everywhere. And I just love it as a material. So I started working with it directly, incorporating it in pieces, but also casting it using the forms of basalt. And when I came back to the UK, I was kind of a bit bereft. And so I started looking around for basalt here. And I found that on the Welsh borders, the border between Wales and England, a quarry, which was a basalt quarry. And so I started going there. And they were dynamiting out these, all this, there were just millions of pieces of basalt, piles of it. And the problem was to make a selection from so much. There was so much there, and I would spend the time just looking at these individual pieces, trying to visualize them as a starting point of a process which would end up with a piece in glass. And I would drive away with my car laden with lumps of basalt. And so this is one of them. So the basic form, the profile of the piece is as the basalt was blasted out. It's it's the form and the texture of the basalt. And then I've cast it, worked on it as a wax, cast it in glass, and then polished it and polished this lens into it. And so this was when I really started working with optical glass, which was in the mid-1990s. And so this is one of the pieces that I was doing when I first sort of encountered optical glass and realized that it was what fantastic potential it had as a material. And
you didn't actually name the place where the quarry is near. It's actually a quarry. Well, no, it's a quarry that actually is used for roadstone and has been for many years.
Yes,
and
it's on the Welsh borders, and it's near to Ludlow. It's on the Clee Hill, which is sort of above the town Ludlow.
And Ludlow is one of the finest Georgian towns in Britain, with the most beautiful and very large church, which has the finest blue stained glass in Britain. And for me, I only discovered about this Ludlow connection over this sort of process of putting the lectures together. And it's actually the town where in the churchyard, my mother, my father, my aunt, my grandmother, and my uncles, the ashes of all of them are buried in the churchyard. So for me, that's another wonderful collection, and completely serendipitous, because I didn't actually know that. But it makes it all the more worthwhile to own. So moving on, there is a connection between Sally and Colin, because Sally interned with Colin for some time, and this lady, whose name is Nina McGarver, she interned first of all with Philip, but also I knew her sister very well, because about 10 years ago, the sister for 5 years worked in the opera festival that my wife and I ran in France, in the south of France. And she was one of our sort of helpers. And I heard about her sister was a glassmaker, but never met her until she came to England. And I met her about 3 years ago. And she said, did I know anybody else who could work? So she then went and interned with Sally and Rick. So there is a sort of grandfather-daughter, granddaughter line from Colin to Sally to Nina. So it's another nice connection. And the other thing is, for this opera festival, for the 18 years of it, we finished, I think, fortuitously, given where we are today, last year. We had a young artist program, which always included a singing competition, and the winner always had a piece of glass that we had commissioned. And I think Sally Fawkes and Rick Jackson made 3 of them, might be 4. And Nina made the last one last year. And this, she said, is all about, it's curved and it's looking, it's the singer looking at the audience and all these heads and then the lights and that sort of thing. And it's a lovely piece. And she comes from a long line of artists, because her grandfather was one of Britain's best known potters called Michael Casson. And her parents were also potters. So, and commissioning, I should say, is to my mind a very important part of my collecting process, partly driven, I might say, by my wife's rule, that though she's very tolerant of the amount of glass in the house, and she's chosen much of it, she has a rule, she says, of one in, one out. And so instead I commission things for various people, and we'll come back a bit more to that in a minute. But I do occasionally sneak the odd piece in. So moving on, that's neat. Now, can we unmute again? Does anybody know who this is?
David Rickey.
What?
David Rickey.
Well done.
It is indeed, and it's very early, David Rickey. Again, I bought this in an auction, so I think we'll hand over to Mr. Rickey.
Right, thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to see a few old friends out there as well from the States and from the UK. This piece I made in 1989. It was part of a series. This is called The Bored Man, and it was a series that sort of represented all different sort of human emotions. So there were laughing men and smiling men, and you know, just basically looking at the human condition. It's basically quite a small piece, but for me, I suppose, and it's in lead crystal, but it's heavily coloured with a black enamel. Which gives the sort of like the colour.
He's about 5 inches high, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, in fact, we've got one of these guarding our front door, Mark.
Really? Oh, well, there we are then. He's a good company.
And I suppose it's very relevant at the moment, you know, because most people are pretty bored at the moment.
Quite. Bored man is it. Anyway, moving on.
Okay, so this is a Home Sweet Home. From 2000 and where are we? 2005. So it's Home Sweet Home 3. There were only 3 pieces. I looked at this. I only made 3 of these, Mark. Right. And they were a reaction, really, to it's like an ironic title, because in 2005 there were a lot of big weather disasters throughout the world, including a big tsunami in Asia. And so a lot of people lost their homes. And so like the whole idea of, you know, the fragility of your home was on my mind. So that's the sort of like, in a sense, the way in which these buildings are all a bit higgledy-piggledy. And then you've got this character balancing on top. And I think you said that the exhibition that it came from, the title was Fear. So right. It's also fear of losing your home.
Perhaps I should just explain where I bought it. I have a house, I think, as I sort of indicated, at least from the fact we have this opera festival, we have a house in Nice, in the south of France. And about 30 minutes outside Nice is probably, in my view, the best glass gallery in Europe. Called the International Glass Gallery. It's also in a complex which also has a blowing shop and sells lots of glass that they make on site. And it's run by a brother and sister. And the brother runs the art gallery. His name is Serge Lashansky, lovely man. And he sells all sorts of glass, British, French, Czech, Australian, and very strongly represented with Americans, which includes Tom Patty, Stephen Weinberg, Doug Anderson, Gary Beecham, Howard Bentray, all those sorts of people. And he was very generous in the sort of, around this period. He used to buy the back page of our opera program. And I bought this because he sent me the artwork for it, and this was on it. And I said, oh, yes, I'll buy it. I never saw it. I bought it unseen, and it suits us well because we're having 2 houses is a juggling match. Perhaps not quite what you intended, but it has that personal sort of piece about it. Moving on then to the rock thrower, who you saw in the very early photographs, who's casting his rock at my collection, about to destroy it all.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I mean, I mean, my work is obviously figurative, but it's also very socio-political. So I'm tending to look at the society around me all the time. And in 2012, when this piece was made, we had the London Olympics. So there were people throwing for sport, javelins and the shot put, etc. But also in that year we had the London riots as well. So people were throwing things like rocks, in the riots. And so in a sense, this was a sort of a comment, because it was for an exhibition called Glass Games that the Contemporary Glass Society put on at the Red Street Gallery in London. And so in a sense, it was a fairly poignant sort of time with the Olympics of these riots going on.
I just like the iconoclastic sort of idea of he's throwing the rock at my collection.
Well, that's it, yeah.
It could all come down any minute. Anyway, thank you very much, David. That was very lovely.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
So I have bought quite a lot of pieces from this glass gallery in the south of France. This is one of the most important pieces I probably own. This is the probably best known French artist, Antoine Leperlier, along with his brother Etienne. And this is a sort of piece from, I suppose, about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, in this house, it's very difficult to display. I think I had it at the beginning. It was on display, one of the photographs I had at the beginning. You can only look at it as it is on the left-hand side. So you can only see it from that. What you can't see is, if you look at it end on, is the fact that the glass looks perfect, or almost perfect. And in case you wonder, the words on the steel frame are the last lines of Dante's Inferno. So again, everything's falling around about us. Now, can you unmute? I've sort of probably been a bit hard in the guess who, but this is American. So I'm expecting somebody from our American audience here to tell me who this is.
Steve Weinberg.
Sorry?
Steve Weinberg.
You're absolutely right. Good. Well done. Thank you. I bought this also from it's a wonderful piece. I actually have it on a turntable because it's 3D, because the back plane of this triangle, so to speak, they're hollowed out. So they are and it's a wonderfully lovely piece. I have a more typical Steve Weinberg, which is this. Again, I think I bought this probably 15 years ago at least, which I love, and it sits on the windowsill to my left now. How about this? Can anybody tell me who this is? My American friends, who's this?
Bill Goodenrath.
Well done. I bought this in Gas at Corning. I love Corning. I've been twice now. Once was for the Gas, which was 2016. This was in the auction. I think I was encouraged by Catherine Coleman, who we'll see shortly, to buy this. And I think it's a fantastic piece. And I just love the whole thing about Corning. I love that it's the best glass gallery in the world, the glass museum in the world. And it has this wonderful hot shop. But I don't really need to tell you that. But our English audience, who may never have been, I can tell you, if you ever go to New York, it's worth the 4-hour journey north and back again, stay the night and visit the museum. Fantastic place.
Did you watch Bill work?
Sorry?
Did you watch Bill work?
Yes, I did, I think. Yeah, I did. I think so, yes. In fact, I did, yes. I mean, he's an amazing maker.
It's about.
I think there's a video online at him at the moment. Does anybody know who this is? This is Gary Beecham. And lastly, who's this?
Patty.
Yeah, now I'm told my friend in the south of France, Serge, he's a great Tom Patty seller and friend, and he said I got. I'm not telling you what I paid, but he said I bought this for not very much money in an auction. I think in California, if I remember rightly. And about 10 years ago, Tom Patty, he had a dinner for Tom Patty in the gallery in the south of France, and he sat my wife next to him because she's bilingual in French and English, and she thought she could help translate, but also to have someone English sitting next to him would be nice. I think she rather disappointed him because she was more interested in his great-grandmother, who was Adelina Patty, who was an extremely well-known opera singer in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, she lived in England. I think she died here in about 1919. However, I'm very proud to own this and pleased to have met him. Right, I'm now going to change the focus to to engraving, which I think is probably not well known in America, not as collected in America as it is here. And I've got a number of engraved pieces, and you're going to see, to my mind, probably in the next 5 minutes, probably 5 of Britain's, or 6, I can't remember how much it is, of Britain's best engravers. The first one is, I think, now retired, although he's still working a bit. This is by a man called Ronald Purnell, and this was the 10th piece. Remember, I showed you the 9 to start with. This is the 10th piece. And I came to know Ronald through actually Richard and Sally, because Richard and Sally and I and Catherine Coleman, who you'll meet in a minute, for I think 12 years, took part in a charity art sale. And this charity art sale was in aid of a children's hospice. And it was run by 9 women. And the committee, when I joined it 3 years after they started, became known as 9 Girls and Mark. And it's still known as that today, although sadly 2 members have died. And at the time, they were all in their 30s. They desperately wanted to put art on their walls, and I hoped on their mantelpieces. They invited me to have a glass section. And we started off quite modestly, but by the end, which was about 3 years ago, we were selling for 3 years probably $50,000 to $60,000 worth of glass in the night, which was pretty good in an English market. And it was an extremely good formula, because the artists were not expected to donate their work. They sharpened their pencils, but we sold the work, and they received their normal price, and we took the gallery commission. And on that basis, we made something like $175,000 to $200,000 almost every year, which we were really pretty proud of. And I met, and in fact, it was an experience for me of being a curator and a gallery owner, which I thought was a very interesting experience, because you learned that you couldn't just sell your own taste. But Ronald took part every year, and after a bit, I said to him, "I own this piece," and he said, "No, that's not me." I said, "Well, I think it looks extremely like your style, and what's more, I know that it was sold originally through Liberty's, a very well-known shop in London." And he eventually agreed, and there's this wonderful book of his which describes he also makes bronze medals and that sort of thing, but and as well as being a glass engraver. And it's this cartoon, he looks like that, and it says, it always has dogs. Much of his work features a dog, and you'll see the dog is saying, "It's a forgery," and he's saying, can't remember exactly what he said, but it must be mine. And I just think it's a lovely thing to own with the piece. These blocks he used to make specially for us, and I had a rule that I would never buy anything till the end, i.e. the people who came, or 500 people usually who came, they got the opportunity to buy, and I only bought at the end. And he made those for us. And this is another piece. This is another piece that this piece is actually a bit different, because he when he retired about 3 years ago, he decided to sell off lots of pieces in his house, and he sent us all photographs, and I said, "Oh, I love this, it looks great." And I didn't bother to ask him anything else. And then about 3 days later, this huge box arrived, and I discovered the piece I bought, which I thought was sort of 6 inches high, was actually twice that, and also virtually the same in circumference. But it is magnificent, and I have this on a turntable, and as you can see, it features the dog as always. Moving on, my mother, you saw at the very beginning, she bought me a royal goblet, and she collected royal goblets, and I have them. I have about, I think, 8, 9 of them. And I'm not sure if there are any members of the Ennian Society from Corning here tonight or today.
Yes.
If you came, you might have come to my house if you did the visit. I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought I'd better do some research, because I thought you might ask me embarrassing questions which I couldn't answer. And I researched all these goblets, at least as far as I could. And on the book, this is a goblet made by a man called P. Dreiser, and that was very clear here. His signature was crystal clear. And he made it for the investiture of Prince Charles as the Prince of Wales in 1969, which you can see on the goblet. And he made them for a very well-known shop in London called Thomas Good in Mayfair, which specializes in, well, it does everything, particularly ceramics, selling dinner services and that sort of thing, but it also sells glass as well, drinking glasses, as well as some art glass. And he made this, and then he was a German who'd come to Britain after the war, and because of the money Thomas Good made from this, he was able to decide to go out on his own, and he did that, and he also taught. And I knew that he had taught Catherine Coleman, who you'll meet in a minute, and I also discovered in doing this research that he'd made 16 half-hour recordings for the British Library, because he was very distinguished, British Library being our national library. And I picked one at random, completely at random, and I picked number 9, I think it was, and I suddenly heard him saying, "Oh, Catherine Coleman was a wonderful student of mine, and she was absolutely brilliant, and she's doing great things." And I rang Catherine up, because she's a very good friend of mine, and I said, did you know he said these things about you? He said, "I don't believe it, because throughout his life he was a hard taskmaster and never gave me any compliments at all." Anyway, with that, Catherine, I'll pass over to you.
Right. Thank you very much for asking me to talk as well. Peter Dreiser was such a patient and generous teacher. He gave me a lot of support. He taught in this little night school. He was so generous, but he's very, very strict and a hard taskmaster. So when he made those recordings, if you ever come to listen to them, they are interesting. But he obviously thought they weren't going to be nobody was going to be allowed to listen to them for 50 years. So I found it wonderful hearing his voice again. Anyway, about me, my particular interest in glass is about what happens in the glass when you polish and engrave the outside surface, especially if you go through colour onto clear glass and it's thick-walled. Then you get a repeat of what you've done outside going into the glass, and the glass starts to take on its own life, an inner life of its own. This little paperweight you can see on Mark's picture is tiny, and it's only engraved just around the outside. It's like a cylinder, and if you were to hold it up and look down through that central hole, all you would see is clear glass with a slight black rim around the outside, no pattern at all. But when you place it on a table like this, you can see the pattern repeating on the floor of the prism and on the walls and down the central hole, and it goes on and on like a kaleidoscope. And that's the sort of thing that pleases me to do.
My guess is on your screen, this is about life size. It might be a little bigger, but unless you've got a very big screen. If you're looking on a laptop or a normal PC screen, it's probably about life size.
It's only about 4 inches across, so it's tiny. This bowl with the goldfish on it was one of a pair that I engraved as a demo for the 2016 gas conference at Corning. Engraving's not a spectator sport, really. It's such a slow process. So I had to make 2 identical ones. I took a finished one with me, and then its twin engraved in various stages, so I could do it like a cookery demonstration on television. You know, here's one I did before, and this is what we do with the rest of it.
I thought you made rather good progress when I watched you.
Well, it wasn't a very big bowl. I had to bring both over in my luggage, so they couldn't be big. What you can't tell from the image, though, with this sort of shape, is that it's only engraved on the outside surface, although you can see hundreds of fish inside, and that the fish inside aren't fixed because they're just reflections, so that when you move the bowl in your hands, if you sort of wiggle it about, then you start to see the fish move, because they're not fixed. Again, that's just a sort of conceit I like to do with my work. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you. Moving on to, I'm just going to go over 2 or 3 other engravers I have in my collection. This is Peter Furlonger, who's a wonderful letterer. He he made this for my 25th anniversary of my working in my company. And because he has done, I've commissioned many pieces from him for my company for various reasons. In fact, he's doing one for me at the moment. And for those of you who are curious as to what it says around the outside, you'll have to read as I go. It starts at the bottom going anti-clockwise. So just to be clear, we're talking about this direction. It's a quote from a Dylan Thomas poem called Fern Hill, and it says, "Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea." And what appealed to me about this is I worked in marine insurance for, well, this was my 25th anniversary. I actually worked in the company for 38 years, and I thought somehow the sea connection and the sea quote was just a nice thing. This is Allison Kinnaird, also a lovely piece, not very well photographed, I'm afraid, but it's a block and it looks good both from the front and the side, as you can see. She is Scottish, slightly moved on from this and does a lot of work now with fiber optics in her engraving and colouring the pieces. And she has a major work in the Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh. So, and I have a couple of engravings by her. This is possibly the new kid on the block in one sense. So she's sort of really come to the fore in the last 3 years. Not that I don't wish to be respectful, but she's not sort of 23-year-old. But she's very talented. Her name is Nancy Sutcliffe. This is a small piece. I just love it, lovely colours and lovely engraved, and she uses gold leaf. And talking about commissioning, she is probably been involved in the most major and prominent commission that I have been involved in. About in 2017, I was approached to help Wimbledon Tennis Club, the Wimbledon Tennis Club, to commission a glasswork for their 2018 tournament, because they have a new artistic work, usually a painting, but this year they wanted a glasswork every year for every championship. And I held a competition, and Nancy and her and a blower called Katie Husky won the competition, and they produced these two very large discs, which were blown by Katie, about 80 centimeters across. And you can see on the left is a tennis ball, on the right is the bounce of the ball. And then engraved on the gold and or on the glass on the left are symbols of Wimbledon. And here are some of them. You can see the trophy, you can see the strawberries and the strawberry flowers. And they are a fantastic piece. And they are in a very prominent position because they're on a staircase, what's known as an imperial staircase, which is one of the staircases where you have a central stairs, then branches out to the left and right, turns back on itself. And these are on the windows on where it branches out opposite them. And they go up, you can't miss them. And every champion or every tennis player walks past them, because the corridor you can see behind are the corridors to the royal box. So not only are they seen by the players, but also by some quite eminent people. So that's Nancy Sutcliffe. This is Sam Herman, who you probably know, American, who came to the UK, I think in the sort of early 70s, and was really the person who brought the studio glass movement to the UK. He taught in, I think, both in Stourbridge and then in the Royal College of Art. And he was very instrumental in making it all happen in the UK. And he did the same in Australia as well. David Rickey, you might want to add something to that.
As you say, Mark, he was a very important person. I mean, he was one of Harvey Littleton's first students, and he actually came to this country in about '67, and went first to Edinburgh College of Art, and worked with Helen Turner up there, and then he came to Stourbridge, and he was, as he moved around these colleges, and then he went on to the Royal College, he was introducing the whole technology of the small studio furnace. So in a sense, you know, then of course he set up the glass house in London, which became, you know, quite an important centre for contemporary blown glass. And then he moved on to Australia and set up the jam factory there. So,
and then came back here, and I think lives here now.
Yeah.
Okay. This is an amusing conceit, really. We talked about Sars pottery, Sally Fawkes did, and it is this amazing museum. It's a sort of very mini Corning now, because in the last 5 years they've built this beautiful modern building to house this modern glass collection, and it's a fabulous place right in the north of France. It's quite difficult to get to, but it is worth the detour. It's near Champagne country, which is perhaps another excuse. But this gentleman, whose name is James Maskery, was an intern there about 15 years ago, before the museum was built. It was then in a house in the village. And first night he arrived, he went out to dinner in the local cafe, and he had the worst duck à l'orange he'd ever eaten. So this piece is known as Hommage à duck à l'orange, and I intend to give it back to the museum. In fact, I've been collecting the materials to pack it up. But it's had a slightly interesting career with myself, because it was on one of those windows on our stairs, and our cat knocked it off. And surprisingly, it bounced. And the only thing that happened was the duck snapped off. And James very kindly reassembled it. And so he's, as he always was, he didn't actually snap off. I think he just broke where it had been glued on in the first place. But it was extraordinary. James makes some really wonderful whimsical pieces, and has made a whole series about Robert Scott, who was the famous British polar explorer in 1911, who failed to get to the pole first. He was a captain in the Royal Navy, which is part of the attraction for me, because my father was in the Navy. And he was a sort of, to my mind, sort of a romantic hero. He also had made some wonderful pieces around Shackleton, which is our other well-known polar explorer. But the message in the bottle is the last words in Scott's diary. I can't remember what the first line is, but it starts in the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. Last entry, for God's sake, look after our people, which is really rather touching, I suppose. It's the right word. And I love this piece. It's just, to me, sort of really poignant. A few other English pieces which you sort of might connect with. Peter Leighton is really the doyen of the British glass scene. He originally came from Hungary, but I think lived in England most of his life. And he has a wonderful gallery and blowing shop right in the middle of London, by the Shard, which has been a great success. And he made this piece with another glass blower called James Devereux. And Peter has really been tireless strength to promoting glassmakers, and he has a number of people here work in his shop and are displayed by him. This is probably the best pâte de verre maker in Britain. Her name is Margaret Olsen. This is a beautiful piece, quite small bowl, about 4 or 5 inches across. This lady is German, but has lived and worked in Britain for a very long time. Her name is Heidi Brechler. She makes two things that are particular about her work. One is the color, and you can see how the color changes. These are 5 individual blocks that fit together, and which is the other point about her work. It's this wonderful balance that she has. She has these pieces that rock, and they're beautifully balanced. And this, you think the whole thing's going to fall over, but actually it's amazingly designed and put together. And she's just been bought by the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is fantastic. These arguably are the best Graal bowl makers in Europe. They live on the North Yorkshire moors, name of Stephen Jones and Stephen Gillis and Kate Jones. They trade as also as Gillis Jones, and they make both production work and also these beautiful bowls, which are unique pieces. And they live on the North Yorkshire moors in the middle of nowhere. Again, absolutely worth the detour to go and see them. And this bowl, the countryside around them looks like this and has these marks on it, as they would say, and it's wonderful. And you may remember that when Philip was talking about his work, the discs, I said, remember the stand. But about 10 years ago, she made the prize for our opera festival, and it was a disc on a stand. And when she finished it and it was on the stand, I said, I know this stand. My Guggisberg Baldwin discs sit on it. Yes, she said. Well, we interned with them, and in fact, Stephen, I learned the other day, may well have blown or finished the pieces you saw in the first, the production pieces that you saw in the first slide there. So again, another lovely connection. This is all down to gas in Murano. I again love the gas conference in Murano. I thought it was a really insightful and interesting, and we went to wonderful places. And I'd been rather jaundiced about Murano because I've been before and I'd been disappointed. Too much tourist glass, too much glass that was expensive and not really marked as, or numbered or anything like that. It wasn't even seemed to be a limited edition for pieces costing, I don't know, $3,000-5,000. But I transformed my view, and I did feel actually changes were going on. But this man blew me away. This is Livio Seguso. I went to his studio twice, and I bought this piece. It's interesting. It was one of 20 until his assistant said, "Well, yes, but he only ever made 5, and there'll never be another 15. So you've got 1 of 5." And I think this is number 1, which is fantastic. I think I'm right in saying that he was, while we were there, he received the Lifetime Artistic Achievement Award from GAS, as Kristen reminded me, Harvey Littleton did in 1993. So that's just another connection. So I just think it's a lovely memory for me of the exhibition, of the conference in 2018. So a few other pieces that we quickly run through. I mentioned about Blanka Adamantova, the Czech artist. This is a much bigger piece with her. It's about 1 foot high. It's a wonderful abstract head, which I rather like. This is Bohumil Eliáš Jr. I bought this on a visit to Czechoslovakia, to Czech Republic, about, I think, 5 years ago. It's a lovely example of his work. Going to Australia now, this is another size piece. This is by a woman called Cobie Coburn. I think it was in a boat, but actually it's meant to be about warp and weft. But I bought one unseen, or seen the picture, but not physically seen. And then I suddenly hadn't realized the size. I think I got the invoice and it said the size on it. And I realized the one I bought was about over 3 feet long, and there was absolutely no way I had anywhere to put it. So very kindly, the gallery, the Savia gallery, said, "Oh, well, no, it's fine. Let's choose another piece." So I did, and this is what we chose. This is coming to the end. Another thing I've done is to sponsor various things, and you may or may not know that in 2008 we first started having the British Biennale, which takes place in Stourbridge every 2 years, although 1 year was missed. And as part of that, the Contemporary Glass Society has a sort of, what's the right word? They ask people to make pieces to a theme. And in this particular year, 2012, the theme was medals, because, of course, it was, as already been mentioned, it was the year of the Olympic Games in London. And I've sponsored the Contemporary Glass Society, which is the equivalent of GAS in the UK, but nothing like as big. This exhibition each year, or each 2 years, and part of the deal is I get the right to buy the pieces because they're all for sale, the ones I like at the end. And these are people we've already discussed, or at least 2 out of 3 of them. The top left is David Rickey, the bottom left is Heidi Brechler, and the piece on the right is David's wife, Pam Rickey, who is the administrator of the Contemporary Glass Society. So I've got 2 members of the Rickey family. There is a third who I should get as well. The last piece in this is a very famous artist who collaborated with Richard Jackson and Sally Fawkes to make this piece. It represents AU gold, 79 is the periodic table number. And he also made these pieces. The left is a snowman, the bottom is a paperweight. The bottom right, sorry, the top right is a paperweight. The bottom right is what should have been a tumbler and is actually a jug. And the bottom left is a leaning bowl. You guessed it, I made these with some help. I had a wonderful day blowing, and I think it's really good to go out and experience the making process yourself, because I think you then begin to understand what's behind it. And I had a great day with another great glass player called Stuart Hearn, and these are the pieces I made from the day. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a bit, but I will share it once more. I thought I'd just sort of summarize what collecting is. You've seen quite a good representative sample of my collection. If I had to describe it, it's quite eclectic. I buy what I like. It's rather a trite statement, but I'm not really wedded to anything, although I'm very keen on buying abstract pieces. Not many mixed media. It's not usually the thing I particularly like. As I told you, the wife, because of the wife's policy of one in, one out, I've done a lot of commissioning. And I occasionally sneak one past her, sometimes with her connivance. Of course, what do I do with it? I'm hoping possibly to give it away to an institution, and we're having discussions at the moment. Maybe I'll give them some in advance, and then there will be much more spaces for the one in, one out. I think that you have to be quite obsessive to be a collector, and I think I'm probably that. I also collect hats. I probably would collect watches if I was allowed to, and I'm pretty obsessive about my photography. So that's another thing. I've talked about being engaged with the artists and challenging and encouraging them in a new direction. I've certainly been engaged with Rick and Sal, and I've got a lot out of it, and I hope they are. I've been a member of a lot of organisations, ranging from GAS to most of the British glass societies, and I also know most of the galleries in the UK. I've been involved in sponsorship, as I've talked about, commissioning a lot, and I also, as I mentioned at the end, I like the idea of doing it yourself to get some experience. In fact, my last experience was making neon. That was completely outside my experience, and that was a great day, and I've got one piece to reckon at. So I'll just go back now to sharing my screen. I'm sometimes asked, is there anything you really covet? And there is sort of, you visit the gallery and your friends say to you, what would you steal? What would you not want? And what would you accept as a gift? Well, I'll leave aside I'll come straight to what would I steal. And it would have to be, well, at least I hope it would have to be, yeah. You all know who these are, and I just love the large Karen Lamonts. Two reasons why I haven't got one. No space is the first thing. Even if the wife allowed them in, I'm not quite sure where we'd put it. And I don't think losing the piano would be approved of. But I think her work is absolutely fabulous. And if I had the chance, of course, the other thing is the small issue of price. Last, but one, if you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll think about donating it, and particularly if you were going to go to Sweden, you might donate some of the money you were saved by not going, or your ticket price if you haven't already done that. So I'd ask you just to think about that if you enjoyed this lecture. I, at the end, want to perhaps end on a rather more serious and sober note. I have this piece of glass, and I've got the photograph, and I'm going to show you the real piece in a minute. But I've done it so you can see. It's not as big as this, as you'll see in a minute. But I wanted to show you what it looks like, and you can see the engraving. It says the horizon is the limit of our sight along the bottom. And it splays up wonderfully, as you can see, into the glass, which is a semicircle. And if you can just hold on a minute, I need to get the piece. and just get this up. So this is the piece. You will never guess what this is or what the piece of glass was. This is a lens, or half a lens, for the periscope of a nuclear submarine. And this is one of the blanks. This particular engraver, her name is Charmian Makata, got these, and she's now retired. But it is a fantastic piece. I just love the way the whole thing is all about lettering and how the light, which sort of Catherine talked about, works. And the quotation I read to you is not quite right. Well, in the sense it's an abbreviated version because she couldn't fit it all on. The original quotation comes from William Penn, yes, he of Pennsylvania, who was born in about, I think, 1640, died in 1718. And he wrote this wonderful poem, the two lines of which includes this quote, were immortalized also by Carly Simon in a song in 1990. And the original quote, which I think is very poignant for where we are today, is this: "And death is only an horizon, and horizon is nothing save the limit of our sight." Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
fascinating.
Wonderful, lovely.
I don't know how I did on the time.
I was muted myself. We are just a bit over our time. I'm so thankful to Mark, for our artists, and for everyone for being here today. Thank you so much for being supportive of the Glass Art Society. As I mentioned, we are a bit over our hour, but if you have questions and you would like to stay, our artists are here. Mark is here to discuss his collection, and I will open it up to anyone. Just speak up. If we have to, I think we can mute everyone if we need to, but if you have any questions, please ask away.
Deathly silence.
There always is.
Mark?
Yes?
It's not a question, but I can tell you a little bit more about that lens.
Yes.
There was a very famous glass engraver called Jane Webster in the 60s and 70s.
Called who?
Jane Webster.
Right.
And she used to get her glass specially ground into forms by two old men in a basement in Ealing. And they were going to retire, and somebody told us about them. And Charmian and I went to see them. And they had this stock of ex-Sherman tank lenses for their periscopes. And Charmian and I fought like tooth and nail over the submarine one. So you've got the one that got away from my hot little hand.
Did you get one?
No, there was only one of them.
Oh, there's only one. Now, you see, that's, I think, the wonderful thing about this community and about the collectors is that the wonderful stories that come out and the wonderful connections, as I've tried to describe some of them. It's fantastic now that I discovered from Catherine a new thing about this piece. I mean, it's wonderful.
I'd like to tell you all, as we record this session and intend to put it online during the GAS virtual conference coming up at the end of May, I just really attached to Mark's stories because I think that he shows, of course, collecting takes the funds to do so, but it's often about the relationships that we build with artists, with other people, and the stories that come out of those things that make collecting really what it is. So it's not always about having the money to do it, but the passion and the drive and the relationships that you have, that those collections are created.
Well, I hope I also shown that you can start very small. You know, I started by buying Costa Boda pieces and other Scandinavian pieces, and then, you know, you get more ambitious, or perhaps you get wealthier along the way, you know, and so you buy other things. But even today, I will buy small pieces as well as big. Not that I buy many, but I do buy some. you know, and I'm interested that I've actually realized also in the course of this, preparing this, that I have a lot of quite unusual works from the artists, the early works like David talked about, for instance, and also from Philip. So that I think is really nice.
Certainly, I think the relationship that can develop between a collector and an artist is very important. And both Sally and I have always relished and really enjoyed meeting people who we would never normally meet in the way of our normal life, because usually we're in our studio beavering away. And I think that's something that all artists enjoy as a way of another step away from the work that you do.
Good. Any other thoughts? What about your American collectors? How do you sort of react to some of the things you've heard? Is it things that you experience, or you know, what's your feelings about some of this?
Hello, Mark.
Hello.
My name is Graham Fisher. We met 5 years ago.
We did.
We did indeed. For your other listeners, I'm the long-haired geezer who looks like he rides Harley Davidsons, which I do. And it's once I submit, the time has been kinder to you than me.
And we sat on the jury together.
We did indeed. A thoroughly enjoyable experience. I am the PR and communications man for the British Glass Foundation, as you may know. And all I'd like to do is say two things. First of all, thank you for an absolutely superb performance. And secondly, can I assure you, the BGF, although we're looking to build a world-class museum in Wordsley in Starbridge in the UK for the Starbridge Glass Collection, we are also still an umbrella organisation with the whole glass world. And if any of your colleagues want to send us any information of what we're doing and promote what the wonderful world of glass, despite the COVID clampdown, we are looking to support everything the glass world is doing, and our website and our email facilities and everything are open to you and everybody else in helping you to promote the wonderful world of glass. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We will support you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
Good.
Well, if we have no more questions, I would like to do one last thank you to Mark. I have had the pleasure of getting to see his program a few times now as he's presented it to other organizations around the UK and now for the Glass Art Society. And I would just like to give you a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you for all turning up. It was good.
Yes, wonderful. All right. Well, at that,
So I shall end the meeting.
okay. Thank you
Bye-bye,
all so much.
everybody. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.